Addie Prescott, was 18 years old, and she had $4.30 to her name. That was all that was left after the funeral, after the debts, after the men in town stopped pretending they were sorry for her, and started looking at her like a problem to be solved. With that $4.30, she was about to buy the old Colton Street livery stable, a sagging building with a caved-in roof, and a smell of mold that clung to your coat for days. Most folks in Millbrook Hollow said it wasn't worth the nails holding it together. They said Addie Prescott, orphaned and alone, was throwing away her last coins on a building that couldn't be saved, the same way she'd thrown away her chance to marry sensible, and let some man take care of her. Beside her, always beside her, was a big brindle dog named Bear, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down, and a way of leaning his whole weight against her leg whenever the whispering started. He had done it every day since her father died. He did it now, outside the stable, like he already knew what she was about to do. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Addie Prescott and her faithful dog Bear. If you've ever felt like the underdog, like folks wrote you off before you even had your chance, tell us in the comments. And if you've ever seen worth in something everybody else called worthless, we want to hear that too. Now let's get into it. Addie's father, Thomas Prescott, had been a blacksmith and a horseman, one of the few in Millbrook Hollow who could gentle a spooked animal just by standing near it and talking low. He'd built his forge with his own hands the year Addie was born, and he raised her in the smell of hot iron and horse sweat, teaching her to read a horse's ears before she could read her letters. Her mother had died when Addie was 6, a fever that swept through in a wet spring, and after that it was just the two of them, father and daughter, working the forge together. He never treated her like she was too small or too soft for the work. By the time she was 10, she could shoe a horse herself, start to finish, and do it well. He taught her plenty of things at that forge, but the one she carried closest was a saying he repeated so often, it wore a groove into her mind. "A debt paid quiet is a debt paid twice," he used to say, meaning that the honest thing and the loud thing were rarely the same thing, and a person who did right, without needing the whole town to watch, was worth 10 who only did right for an audience. He said it about money owed, about kindness owed, about anything a person carried that needed setting right. Addie didn't understand it fully as a girl. She would come to understand it a great deal better as a young woman. The dog came into their lives the winter Addie turned 14. A traveling drover left an abandoned litter behind at the edge of town, and Thomas found the last surviving pup half frozen under a wagon, more mud than dog, whimpering into the cold. He carried it home inside his coat and set it by the forge fire, and it was Addie who stayed up 3 nights running, feeding it warm milk from a rag, willing it to live. It lived. It grew into a broad-chested, brindle-coated animal with startling amber eyes, and Addie named him Bear because, she said, he looked like he could wrestle one and win. From that winter on, Bear followed her everywhere. He slept outside her door. He sat at the forge while she worked, watching the sparks with an expression that looked almost like pride. He was, in every way that mattered, hers. Addie remembered one particular evening from when she was 12, a memory she would return to often in the hard months ahead. A traveling merchant had come through with a lame mule, certain the animal was finished, ready to sell it for scrap leather rather than pay for its care. Thomas Prescott looked the mule over for a long while, running his hands down its legs, checking its teeth, listening to its breathing, while the merchant grew impatient beside him. "Everybody else calls this animal worthless," her father finally said, more to Addie than to the merchant, "but worthless is just a word for something nobody's taken the time to understand yet." He bought the mule for almost nothing, nursed it back to soundness over a slow winter, and sold it in the spring for 10 times what he'd paid. Addie was young enough then to think it was simply a clever bit of business. She would come to understand, much later, that her father had been teaching her something far bigger than horse trading. Here is a thing we should tell you now, though its full weight won't come clear until later. Long before Addie was born, her father had held a deed to a piece of land at the edge of town, land with good water and better timber, land he'd meant to build his real homestead on someday. That deed disappeared from town records sometime in Addie's early childhood, and Thomas Prescott spent years quietly trying to sort out the confusion, always told by the county office, that the paperwork must have been lost in a fire some seasons back. Always told to be patient, that it would surface. It never did. He let it go, in the end, the way tired men let go of fights they can't afford to keep fighting, and he built his small forge house instead, and never spoke of the lost land again except in a tired voice late at night, when he thought Addie was asleep. The fall came fast and cruel. It started with a cough Thomas couldn't shake through the autumn, then a fever that settled into his chest and wouldn't leave. Addie nursed him the same way she'd nursed Bear as a pup, staying up through the nights, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, begging him to eat. The town doctor came twice, and shook his head both times. Thomas Prescott died on a gray morning in early November, with Addie holding one of his hands, and Bear pressed against his other side, whining low in his throat, refusing to leave the room even when neighbors tried to coax him out. Grief alone would have been enough to bear. But grief was only the start of what came for Addie that winter. It turned out her father, in his final year, had taken a loan against the forge to cover his medical costs, a loan held by the town's most prominent banker, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Elias Colton, who owned half the buildings on Main Street, and sat on the town council besides. When Addie went to the bank to ask about payment terms, hoping to work the forge herself, and pay the debt down slow, Colton informed her, with an apologetic little smile that never touched his eyes, that the note had come due in full upon her father's death, and that the forge and the house attached to it now belonged to the bank. She had 2 weeks to clear out her belongings. Addie packed what little she owned into a single trunk, working through her shock in silence, and Bear stayed pressed against her ankles the entire time, as though holding her upright by sheer will. Neighbors who had known her family for years suddenly found reasons not to meet her eyes on the street. A girl alone, with no father, no husband, and no property, was not a person Millbrook Hollow quite knew what to do with. Some offered pity, a few offered worse, hinting that a pretty young woman in her situation ought to find herself a husband quickly, before her situation grew any more desperate. Addie thanked them politely, and kept walking, Bear at her heel, her chin up even when her hands shook. Those first weeks alone were the hardest of Addie's young life, harder even than the days at her father's sickbed, because grief at least had a shape she understood, while this new uncertainty had none. She would wake some mornings in the borrowed loft above Whitaker's store, reach out of habit for a floor that wasn't there, and lie still a long moment, listening to Bear's slow breathing beside her, before she could make herself rise and face the day. It was Bear, more than any kind word from a neighbor, that kept her moving forward those weeks. He never once looked at her the way the town did, never once seemed to wonder whether she was still worth his loyalty now that she had nothing left to offer him but scraps and a warm place to sleep. She took work where she could find it, mending harnesses, mucking stalls, doing the kind of labor most folks in town considered beneath a lady, but which Addie had never once been ashamed of. She slept some nights in the loft above Whitaker's feed store, in exchange for sweeping the floors, and other nights in a lean-to she built herself behind the old chapel, with Bear curled against her for warmth. Word traveled fast in a small town, and it wasn't kind. Poor Addie Prescott, they said, brought low so quick, and her with such fine people for parents too. Shame really. Addie heard every word of it, and let it slide off her like rain off tin, because there was nothing to be done about talk, and there was work to be done about supper. It was in this stretch of hard months that she first passed the old livery stable on Colton Street, a building that, in a twist Addie found almost too bitter to laugh at, also belonged to the bank, having been seized from its previous owner some years back, and left to rot, ever since nobody wanted the trouble of it. The roof had partly caved on the north side. The stalls inside were choked with old straw and rat nests. But the bones of it were good oak. Addie could see that even from the road, and there was a forge pit out back gone cold and rusted but not beyond saving. She started stopping by it on her walks, just to look, the way a person looks at something they can't quite explain wanting. The county was set to auction the stable off that spring, mostly because it sat empty and unpaying on the tax rolls, an embarrassment nobody in town office wanted to keep explaining. Addie had, by then, scraped and saved every spare coin from months of hard labor, down to a battered tin she kept hidden beneath a floorboard in her lean-to. The night before the auction, she counted it all out by lantern light, and found herself staring at $4.30. It was nothing, it was less than nothing, against a building, even a ruined one. But it was what she had, and something in her, some stubborn ember passed down from a father who never gave up on a struggling horse, told her it might just be enough for what nobody else wanted. Bear sat watching her count the coins, head tilted, tail giving one slow thump against the dirt floor, as if he already agreed with whatever she was about to decide. The morning of the auction was bright and cold, the kind of sharp spring light that makes even ruined things look almost hopeful. A small crowd gathered outside the stable, more out of curiosity than genuine interest, since nobody serious was bidding on a building most considered a lost cause. The county property agent, a thin, tired man named Dunmore, stood on an overturned crate reading off the terms in a flat, bored voice, clearly expecting the whole business to be settled quickly and quietly by whichever local businessman wanted the lot cleared for something newer. Addie stood at the back of the small crowd in her one good coat, Bear sitting calm and solid at her side, ignoring the muttering that started up the moment people recognized her. "There goes Prescott's girl," someone said, not troubling to lower their voice much. "Bidding on a wreck like that." "Bless her," someone else answered, though there wasn't much blessing in the tone. "Poor thing's got nowhere else to put herself, I suppose." When Dunmore called for opening bids, there was a long pause. Nobody wanted to be first to throw good money after a caved roof. Finally a man near the front offered $3, more as a joke to see what would happen than as a real bid, and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Addie felt her heart hammering, but she stepped forward anyway, raised her hand, and said, clear as she could manage, $4.30. The laughter died into an uncomfortable silence. Dunmore blinked at her, looked down at his ledger as though checking whether such a small figure was even legal to record, then shrugged and called for any higher bid. None came. Nobody wanted the trouble of outbidding an orphan girl for a ruin worth less than the effort of tearing it down. "Sold," Dunmore said, sounding almost apologetic about it, "to Miss Prescott, for $4.30. A few people actually clapped, the kind of pitying applause you give a child for trying. Others simply shook their heads and drifted off toward more interesting business. Addie walked forward to sign the transfer papers with a hand that trembled only a little, and Bear walked with her, pressing his broad head briefly against her hip, before settling at her feet while she signed, watching the whole proceeding with a stillness that seemed, to anyone paying close attention, almost deliberate. She didn't notice it then. She would understand it soon enough. We should tell you, before we go further, that this small, mocked purchase was about to unravel something that had stayed buried in Millbrook Hollow for the better part of 20 years, and that the mockery aimed at Addie Prescott that morning was about to look very foolish indeed. Addie moved her few belongings into the stable that same afternoon, choosing a dry corner of the old tack room for her cot, and set to work clearing rat nests and rotted straw with a kind of grim, hopeful energy she hadn't felt in months. Bear worked alongside her in his own fashion, trotting the length of the building over and over, sniffing every corner, every stall post, every board, as though conducting his own inspection of the property. Addie thought little of it at first. Dogs sniffed things. That was simply what dogs did. But by the second afternoon, she started to notice a pattern. Bear kept returning, again and again, to one particular stall at the very back of the building, the one nearest the old cold forge pit. He would trot in, go still, nose low to a certain floorboard, and stand there a long moment before moving on, only to circle back to the same spot minutes later. There was a smell in that stall unlike the general mustiness of the rest of the building, something sharper underneath the rot, like old rust mixed with something drier, papery almost. Addie noticed it herself the third time she followed Bear back to that same board, crouching down to run her palm across the wood. The floorboard in question was slightly different from the others around it, she realized once she looked closely, a shade darker, the grain running a hair off from its neighbors, as though it had been cut and fitted separately at some point rather than laid down with the rest of the floor. She pressed on one end, and felt the faintest give beneath her palm, a looseness the surrounding boards didn't have. Bear, beside her, had gone utterly still, ears forward, that low whine building again in his throat, the same sound he'd made the morning her father died, though this was a different kind of urgency entirely, something closer to insistence than grief. She tried to lift the board with her bare hands first, and got nothing for her trouble but a splinter across her palm. The board was set tight, either swollen with old damp or nailed down more carefully than the rest of the floor. Whatever was under there, somebody had wanted it to stay hidden, and hidden it had stayed, through years of the building sitting empty, through however many owners had come and gone before the bank finally seized it and let it rot. Addie sat back on her heels in the fading afternoon light, bare pressed warm against her side, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long while stir under her ribs. Not hope exactly, something closer to the feeling you get right before a storm breaks, when the air goes still and heavy, and you know, without being told, that something is about to change. That night, she barely slept, turning over question after question by lantern light. Whatever was under that board had been hidden a long time, and hidden things in a small town were rarely hidden by accident. Something bigger than a ruined stable was waiting beneath her feet, and tomorrow, she decided, she would find out what it was, whatever it cost her in splinters and sore hands to get there. She started at first light with a rusted pry bar she'd found tossed in a corner of the tack room, its handle worn smooth from some previous owner's grip. The board fought her harder than she expected. She wedged the flat end into the thin seam at its edge, and leaned her whole weight against it, feeling the old wood groan and resist, feeling the strain climb up through her shoulders and into her back. Bear paced a tight circle around her the entire time, tail low, ears pinned, clearly agitated by the effort, occasionally pressing his nose to the crack she was working as though trying to help pry it open himself. The board finally gave with a splitting crack, loud enough that Addie flinched backward, certain for a moment she'd broken something she shouldn't have. Dust rose in a thin gray cloud, catching the morning light slanting through the caved roof, and underneath the board, she found a shallow cavity dug into the packed earth, lined with what had once been oilcloth, now brittle and cracking at the folds. Inside sat a metal box, small enough to fit in two hands, its surface pitted with rust, but its hinges, when she worked them, still holding. The smell that came up from it was exactly what she and Bear had both caught the day before: old iron and dry paper, the particular scent of something sealed away from air and light for a very long time. The metal of the box was cold against her palms, rough with rust along the seams, and when she turned it over in her hands, she could feel the faint give of something shifting inside, papers sliding against each other with a dry, whispering rustle. Her hands were shaking now, not from the effort of the prying, but from something closer to fear, the kind that comes right before you learn something you can't unlearn. Bear pressed his head into her lap, solid and warm, grounding her, and she took a breath and lifted the lid. The hinges gave a thin metallic groan, the sound of a thing that had not been opened in a very long time finally letting go of its silence. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone soft with age, was a bundle of papers, and on top of them, a ledger book, its leather cover cracked but its pages still legible. Addie opened the ledger with careful fingers, and found columns of names, dates, and figures in a neat, careful hand she recognized with a jolt, because it was the same careful hand she'd seen on hundreds of loan documents over the years, notes and mortgages, and property transfers, all across Millbrook Hollow. It was Elias Colton's handwriting, dated back more than 15 years, long before he'd become the town's most respected banker. What she read in those pages, working through them slow and careful by the gray morning light, raised far more questions than it answered. There were names of half a dozen local families, including, near the bottom of one page, her own father's name, Thomas Prescott, and beside it, a notation about a land parcel at the edge of town, the very same parcel her father used to speak of in that tired, faraway voice late at night. The deed, he always said, had simply gotten lost in a fire. Except here it was, plain as anything, listed not as lost, but as transferred, with a signature beneath it that did not look, to Addie's eye, anything at all like her father's hand. We won't tell you yet what those pages truly proved, only that Addie sat there a long while after reading them, the cold stable around her, Bear's head heavy and warm across her knee, understanding for the first time that the ruin she'd bought for $4.30 had just handed her something far more dangerous, and far more valuable, than good oak beams and a working forge pit. The weeks that followed settled into a steady, careful rhythm. By day, Addie kept working the stable, patching the roof plank by plank, clearing stalls, letting word spread slowly that she was open for boarding horses again, since even a suspicious town needed somewhere to stable its animals. By evening, she pored over the ledger and its accompanying papers by lantern light, cross-checking names, trying to make sense of dates and figures that didn't quite add up on their own. She realized quickly she needed help. She didn't have the training to provide herself, and after turning it over for several restless nights, she brought the ledger to the one man in town she trusted not to run straight to Colton with it. Old Mr. Higgins had been the town's lawyer for 30 years, before easing into a quiet retirement, spending his days now mostly fishing and tending a garden gone half wild. He'd known Addie's father since they were boys together, and he'd been one of the very few people in Millbrook Hollow who still tipped his hat to Addie on the street, with genuine warmth, rather than pity. When she laid the papers out on his kitchen table and explained where Bear had led her to them, Higgins went quiet for a long time, turning pages with the careful hands of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. What emerged, over the following weeks of careful digging through old county records, old bills of sale, and the fading memories of a few longtime residents Higgins gently questioned, was a pattern far larger and uglier than Addie had first imagined. Elias Colton, back when he was a younger, hungrier man, just beginning to build his fortune, had systematically targeted a handful of families across Millbrook Hollow, families with good land and simple trust in official paperwork. He'd arranged, through a clerk long since moved away, to have certain deeds quietly misfiled or destroyed, then approached those same families years later with generous offers to buy land that was, unbeknownst to them, no longer clearly theirs on paper at all. Thomas Prescott's land at the edge of town, the same land Colton now leased out for a tidy yearly sum under his own name, was only one piece of a scheme that had, over 15 years, quietly built the foundation of Colton's entire fortune. Higgins was not the only one who helped, though he was the steadiest. An old widow named Mrs. Beaumont, whose late husband's name also turned up in the ledger, began quietly asking around among longtime residents, gathering memories of who had owned what land and when, memories that filled in gaps no paper trail alone could explain. A young clerk at the county office in the next town, sympathetic to Addie's quiet, careful questions, pulled old filing records after hours, without ever being asked to keep it secret, simply understanding on his own that it mattered. None of them did it for glory or reward. They did it, each in their own way, because something about a girl and her dog uncovering a wrong nobody else had the courage to name, struck a chord that ran deeper than town gossip ever could. Bear stayed close through all of it, a steady watchful presence at Addie's side, through long evenings of reading and cross-checking, through nervous walks to Higgins's house with the ledger wrapped carefully in cloth beneath her coat. More than once she noticed him go rigid and alert at the sound of footsteps on the road outside, positioning himself between her and the door, until whoever passed had moved on. It was as though he understood, in his own animal way, that they were carrying something dangerous now, something that needed guarding as much as any horse in his stalls. There is one more thing worth telling you here, something that wouldn't come fully clear until later. The clerk Colton had used all those years ago, the one who vanished from town not long after, had not vanished entirely. Higgins, through an old contact, managed to track down a letter the man had written near the end of his own life, a confession of sorts, never sent, found among his effects by a relative willing to share it, once Higgins explained what was at stake. That letter, once it arrived, would turn out to be the piece that made everything else undeniable. The letter, when it finally arrived by post one humid morning, was written in a shaking, apologetic hand, the words of a man who had carried a guilty secret to the edge of his own death, and could not quite let it go unspoken. He named names. He named dates. He described, in plain terms, exactly how Elias Colton had paid him, a little at a time over several years, to slip certain deeds out of the county files and quietly record false transfers in their place, always choosing families with no money left over for lawyers, families too busy surviving to notice a piece of paper gone missing until it was far too late to matter. Reading it at Higgins's kitchen table, Addie felt something in her chest go tight, and then, strangely, loose, as though a knot she had been carrying without even knowing its shape had finally come undone. By early summer, Addie and Higgins had assembled a case built not on suspicion, but on paper, on names, dates, and a dead clerk's own confession, thorough enough that even a man as respected as Elias Colton would have no easy way to talk his way clear of it. Addie had also, in the meantime, gotten the stable running well enough to bring in a small but steady income boarding travelers' horses, and Bear had taken to patrolling the property each evening like it was his own personal territory, which in every way that mattered to him, it was. Word reached Colton, as word in a small town always eventually does, that Addie Prescott had been asking pointed questions about old land records, and that Higgins had been seen going through documents late into the evening at his kitchen table. Colton, never a man to sit still while a threat gathered, decided to handle the matter himself, directly, in the way he'd always handled inconvenient people in Millbrook Hollow. He arrived at the stable on a warm evening in late June, stepping down from his fine carriage in a coat too heavy for the weather, his soft-spoken manner gone hard and flat around the edges. Addie was in the yard checking a mare's hoof when he approached, and Bear, who had been dozing in a patch of shade, rose without a sound and placed himself squarely between them, hackles rising slow along his spine, a low growl building deep in his chest that Addie had never heard from him before, not once, in all their years together. Colton didn't so much as glance at the dog. "Miss Prescott," he said, in the tone he likely used to intimidate men twice her size, "I understand you've been digging through old records that don't concern you. I'd advise you, as a friend of your late father's, to leave well enough alone. A young woman alone in the world can find herself in a great deal of trouble, poking at things better left buried." Addie set down the mare's hoof-pick with a steady hand, though her heart was hammering hard enough she was certain he could hear it. She had rehearsed this moment in her head more times than she could count, lying awake at night imagining exactly what she would say if this day ever came, and now that it had arrived, she found the words came easier than she expected, plain and unhurried, the way her father used to talk down a spooked horse. "I think it concerns me a great deal, Mr. Colton," she said, "since one of those old records has my father's name on it, and a signature underneath that doesn't match his hand at all. I've had 3 people who knew him well confirm that. I also have a ledger in your own handwriting, going back 15 years, and a letter from a clerk who wrote down, before he died, exactly how you paid him to misfile deeds belonging to 6 different families in this town, mine included." Colton's face went through a rapid series of changes, condescension collapsing into disbelief, disbelief hardening into something colder and more dangerous. He took a step forward, and Bear's growl deepened into something with real teeth behind it, a sound that made even a man as sure of himself as Colton stop where he stood. "You have nothing," Colton said, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "Nothing a court would take seriously from a girl and a dead man's ramblings." Addie reached into her coat and produced the ledger itself, holding it up just far enough for him to recognize his own handwriting across the cover, and watch the color drain slowly from his face. "Mr. Higgins has copies of everything," she said, "filed with the county clerk in the next town over as of this morning, along with a formal complaint. He also sent word to a newspaperman he knows in the capital, who seemed very interested in a story about a respected local banker forging land deeds for 15 years. I imagine you'll be hearing from both of them soon, if you haven't already." For a long moment, Colton said nothing at all, standing in the golden evening light, with the ruin of his own carefully built reputation settling visibly onto his shoulders. Bear held perfectly still beside Addie, a solid silent wall of protection, watching Colton with those steady amber eyes, until the banker finally turned, without another word, climbed back into his carriage, and rode away far faster than he'd arrived. News of Elias Colton's fall moved through Millbrook Hollow faster than any gossip the town had seen in years. The county clerk's office confirmed the forged transfers within days. The newspaperman Higgins knew arrived within the week, and his story, once printed, spread the scandal well beyond the town's borders. Colton's remaining business partners severed ties within the month. His bank was placed under new management pending a full investigation, and by the time the leaves began to turn that autumn, Elias Colton had quietly left Millbrook Hollow for good, his name a byword for shame rather than respect. The families he'd wronged, including Addie, began the slow process of reclaiming what had been taken from them, a process Higgins guided with the same patient care he'd shown from the very start. A year after that afternoon in the stable yard, Addie Prescott stood in the doorway of a livery stable that no longer sagged or leaked, its roof mended board by board, its stalls full of well-kept horses belonging to travelers and townsfolk alike, its old forge pit glowing again with honest fire. She had, with the return of her father's rightful land, more than enough to build the homestead he'd always dreamed of, but she found, in the end, that she didn't want to leave the stable behind. It had been the ruin nobody wanted, bought for $4.30 by a girl the whole town had written off, and it had given her back everything she'd lost, and more besides. Bear, gray beginning to show now around his muzzle, still patrolled the yard each evening out of habit rather than necessity, still pressed his weight against her leg whenever she stood too long lost in thought. We think often about what it means to see worth in something everyone else calls worthless, whether that's a broken down building, a forgotten deed buried under a floorboard, or a girl the whole town had already counted out. Addie Prescott built a life from the pieces nobody else wanted, with a loyal dog who believed in her before she quite believed in herself. So we'll leave you with this question, the same one Addie might have asked herself that morning she pried up an old floorboard with trembling hands. If you found a hidden piece of history, buried and forgotten, would you keep it for yourself, or would you share it with the world?